Foreign ministers of BRICS countries emphasized last week that any challenges to international peace and security and violent conflict in various parts of the world should be resolved through political and diplomatic engagement. The meeting of the five emerging powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, was held through video conference, with Russia as the BRICS chair. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov led the participants, which included Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the BRICS diplomacy. Joining me on the program today are Manjeev Singh Puri, former ambassador, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and Harsh Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's understand the key takeaways really from the BRICS foreign ministers meet.
Thank you, Frank. Frank, I'm actually happy that this meeting has happened. This was a standalone meeting of the foreign ministers. You know, the BRICS summit is supposed to take place this year in Russia, but has been postponed as a result of the pandemic. Usually, the foreign ministers would have met on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. Even that does not appear possible at all this year. So it was good that the summit was held. And I am glad that you've highlighted one of the important aspects, the takeaways which are there, that look, let's go for political dialogues everywhere in the world. That's what matters. But then remember, these are the foreign ministers that are talking, and foreign ministers are resolute, tough in their talk, but they are about talk and diplomacy. As far as I'm concerned, the important takeaways are, of course, the ones about celebrating 75 years of the United Nations. But I'm glad that we've got the BRICS on board of saying that the UN does need reform. And it was useful to see that the media statement actually pointed out to saying that, look, we have to do something about the Security Council. Now, I know this is a long story, but it's a good thing that it has happened and we are taking things forward. I was also happy to see a kind of resolute coming together of the BRICS countries on counter-terrorism. Now, don't forget, this is important for us. We have been a country which has faced terrorism for a very long time, and we have a very good reason for it. And if you get some of the larger countries in the world to come on board on counterterrorism, that's particularly important. I also see good things in the area of ICT, digital technologies, and so on. But also in the area of WTO, that we look in terms of trying to see what we can do about a regulated and well-run World Trade Organization to the benefit of everyone. Let me make one or two points to you which are not just about the coming together. The media statement mentioned something about COVID. It mentioned something about BRICS efforts on developing vaccines and stuff like that. Now let's remember that a Russian vaccine is already out there. We are hearing things about something the Chinese are doing. In India, there are several trials which are going forward. You know, we are 42% of the world. We matter. And I think for India, coming together with these other large countries, no matter the fact that, you know, at the moment we have a serious issue, a very serious issue, one of them with our neighbors, but coming together is something which is good because it allows us to expand the space possible for countries which are developing countries and countries which are pushing forward on the way the world is currently structured and for finding a place for ourselves. And I think this is particularly important that we have Brazil and South Africa with us, who are also our partners in IPSA. But in this forum, along with two permanent members of the Security Council, two heavy hitters in the world, it's particularly important. It allows us to say our words, put our perspective forward. Remember, we will be hosting the next BRICS summit. This year is Russia, the next year is India. And so therefore, keeping this going is extremely important for us. And I'm glad that the foreign ministers met and discussed the matter.
Absolutely. All right, Pramit, let me bring you to the picture now. You know, it's pandemic time, of course. How has the pandemic impacted the BRICS nations? We saw Brazil was badly affected. We saw that, you know, India is also going through a rough phase, of course. The death rate is not as high as anywhere else in the world, but still the number of cases and, you know, and the growth, the Q1 results of the first quarter, of course, also came out and told us how badly we've been impacted. So looking at the BRICS nations as a whole, how have they been impacted by the pandemic, and also why is this important, or why was this important extremely crucial?
Well, on COVID, as Ambassador Puri's mentioned, there is three of us, three of the BRICS members, do have pharmaceutical and vaccine capacity. We will see how good the vaccines are. But fundamentally, India has been being very careful to spread its bets, if you wish. We have carefully tied up with almost every major vaccine program in the world, partly because we are the world's biggest manufacturers of vaccines. Almost 60 to 70% of the world's vaccines are today produced by Indian companies. So only India actually has the mass capacity to produce doses at very low prices. I mean, the Serum Institute alone can produce 1.5 billion doses at the price of US 50 cents each. And nobody else, no other country in the world has that capacity. Even a lot of the factories in Europe, for example, which do vaccines, are actually owned by Indian companies. So the BRICS is one set of countries, if you wish, both as users of the vaccine, because South Africa and Brazil and India, to some extent Russia, are all being badly affected by COVID-19. South Africa represents 50% of all the cases in Africa, and I think Brazil is close to being about the same in Latin America. So you have, should we say, we have a stake in the entire COVID issue. So that's, I think, not a surprise. Economically, however, BRICS is less capable of contributing, partly because we are not that integrated as a bloc, economic bloc. All of us trade very massively with China, but we don't trade all that much with each other. So India, Brazil, India, South Africa, Russia has virtually no trade whatsoever. So that's been always something we've been working on within the BRICS, but that's a road under construction. So that will take a while. Economically, I don't see us being able to do very much, though we have some common concerns about what's happening. And as I think others, as Ambassador Puri mentioned, and you mentioned, that we're doing this, the summit's being held under the shadow of a fair amount of friction between India and China. So I think it was important for India to make it clear, one, that as far as the BRICS was concerned, India's commitment to the BRICS wasn't going to be rattled or reduced because of the problems it has with China. It also didn't want to humiliate Russia, a country that still has a good relationship with. And I think what we'll see in one of the games that we've been playing, if you wish, a normal diplomatic game, is to use almost any possible venue to send messages to China or to other countries who have some that China potentially listens to, about our concerns about what's happening at the border. And I think there's insistence that we settle differences politically and diplomatically is one of those messages that we would be able to send.
Absolutely. So let me take this particular aspect forward with you, Harsh. As far as personal issues are concerned, do you believe that they come in the way of multilaterals and can jeopardize the larger issues at hand?
Well, certainly, Frank, I think there is always that possibility. And so far, it seems that India has taken a cautious, pragmatic approach to this whole question, and not allowing this particular friction to override or overshadow its engagement with China in multilateral platforms. But I think, what is important is, and very interesting conceptually, is some things that, Indian policymakers have been saying for some time. If you see, Foreign Minister, for example, talking about, he gave an interview a few weeks back where he talked about, the failure of multilateralism. And therefore, and then he talked about how we have these various platforms available to us where we can where we are able to integrate ourselves with the larger international community without getting bogged down into the larger problems that multilateralism is facing at the moment. So I think there is a larger conceptual issue as well, and I think Ambassador Puri juxtaposed it very well when he talked about UN and I think what is the 75th year of the UN and how what happens going forward, and the statement that came out of BRICS also talked about multilateralism, how to strengthen multilateralism. So I think one aspect here which is important is how does India posit itself in a world which is facing severe problems on multilateral front. And therefore, can India work with other countries, with a country like China, for example, with whom we have multiple problems? But the idea that multilateral reforms are important and multilateral reforms can only proceed if countries like China are on board. So I think this message, if it comes out from BRICS, again, it may not have any practical significance going down the road when the multilateral reforms or UN reforms start to be implemented. But I think it's an important signal that India remains committed to the larger multilateral process and its reforms, and it is willing to work with countries, even countries like China, with whom we are facing multiple problems on multiple fronts. So I think that juxtaposition of larger UN reforms, larger multilateral reforms versus the space that India can possibly acquire for itself by working with these smaller groups, with these smaller countries, whether it's G20, whether it's BRICS, whether it is SCO. I think that perhaps is a step forward in that direction, because fragmented multilateralism is going to be the order of the day going forward, unless UN Security Council undergoes significant reforms. And if that is not happening, then India can carve out that particular space by working with these groupings despite the problems. And I think that is something that India is even with all the problems, is not willing to give up at this point. And the message that India is also giving out, whether it's BRICS, whether it's from the SCO platform, to China, conveying to China that, look, if you can have China coming out with a statement that all conflicts need to be resolved, through negotiations, I think that is also a message to the Chinese themselves, that we need to be prepared for a long haul and diplomatically try to resolve this problem, as India has continuously maintained. So in a sense, India is reiterating its diplomatic positions in these fora, whereas China is having to juggle two different responses. Bilaterally, it is saying something else to India, whereas multilaterally, whereas in these platforms, when it sits down with several other countries, it is having to, I don't know whether by force or by design, going forward and sort of, making India's case or putting its stamp on India's response. So I think it seems more or less diplomatically well handled. Of course, going forward, given as Ambassador Puri pointed out, next year we are hosting it. It is also important to have some continuity there in terms of India's engagement with BRICS, with the larger BRICS platform. And I think in that direction, the statement clearly lays out multiple agenda points.
Absolutely. Talking about this aspect of continuity, Ambassador, a few years ago, a lot was being spoken about BRICS. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of momentum. That seems to have died down or mellowed down a bit of late. So at a time like this, how relevant do you think an organization like the BRICS is in the present scenario?
Frank, I am a convinced believer that the countries that constitute the BRICS are countries that are going to be important in the coming years too. Their coming together makes them a sort of tour de force in terms of global multipolarity. Now, if you just look at the history of the BRICS, it came about as a result of a Goldman Sachs study on BRIC, and then we added South Africa because politically that was essential to do. Now, these countries are not the only big players in the world. But remember, the G20, which perhaps symbolizes multipolarity in the best possible manner, is essentially the G7 and the BRICS countries, with some other large countries being brought in there. Therefore, the importance of these countries will continue to remain. And it's important for us to also have dialogue partners whose situations are not markedly different from us, especially on the economic front. As I mentioned, 3 countries, South Africa, Brazil, and India, are among the strong democracies. We are the largest democracy, but they are also large democracies in their own area. You have China there, which is a very big hitter in the world, one way or the other, the second largest economy in the world. And the Russians, let's not underestimate their resoluteness and the power that they still have, the military power. Therefore, to have this kind of grouping, for us to be able to sit down and discuss, is important in terms of the weight that we bring for our ideas and for these ideas in terms of the globe and the global fora. And I remember I just overheard Professor Pant as well as Pramit mention this particular point. This multipolarity, as it merges with multilateralism, That's the crux of the way the UN system has worked. And it's a system where it's generally delivered, although we must remember that it doesn't deliver when the big players themselves are involved. And therefore, you have multipolarity, G20 and those kind of organizations which are there to try and take things forward. So I see relevance for these organizations. I see relevance for this particular thing, but we need to play this particular thing in a manner that we are advantaged, that we are also able to get our ideas through, and not just that you accept the ideas of the others and take this forward. I think we are well positioned to do that.
Okay, all right. We have to focus on our strengths and ensure that our voice is heard is what the ambassador is suggesting. Pramit, let's talk about multilateral reforms now. This is something that both the professor and the ambassador spoke about in their opening remarks. As far as multilateral reforms are concerned, how serious are these nations really in trying to bring about these multiple reforms? And will the other nations, within their continents and within other groupings, allow them to carry out these multilateral reforms?
Well, if you're talking about the biggest one, which is UN Security Council reform, right now we're at an impasse. But, this is a process that will obviously be extraordinarily difficult. And there's a sort of stop-start cycle to this. So we had a few years ago, suddenly a draft text was able to get past the General Assembly. And then it stalled again. And right now we're in that period of stall, and there will be a period when nothing much will happen before the next round hopefully will happen. Right now it's not good, partly because of a number of reasons which are unrelated to the United Nations. For example, one of the original reasons for UN Security Council reform was that Europe was overrepresented. So you had effectively France and Britain for both on the UN Security Council reform, and there was talk that maybe a single European seat would be possible. But now Britain has left the European Union, so obviously Britain is no longer prepared to surrender its seat to a larger European position. Russia now is not so eager to see a dilution of its own position because it has economically declined, if you wish, over the past decade. And China has steadfastly said that Japan, one of the members of the G4 group that India is part of, would be allowed into the Security Council over its dead body because of their long historical problems with each other. So those issues are there. Even Brazil has problems because half of Latin America opposes it, including Mexico, the second most powerful Latin American country. And as you mentioned, the biggest regional problem remains Africa, because while South Africa is there, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, so many other African countries have opposed them. There's been no unity among the Africans about what would be an African chair. But as I said, it's a stop-start thing. The fact that there's even a draft text that has now been accepted by the General Assembly, it was a major step forward. And there was a fair amount of resistance from China and a few other countries on even getting that through, but it did pass. So we'll see. The next cycle will be a little while in coming, largely because I think there's a fair amount of, should we say, uncertainty in the international system right now, whether it's American isolationism, Chinese assertiveness, and of course, a steady bit of chaos in Europe as well. So we'll see where that goes. It's the other multilateral organizations I think we are more concerned about. The WTO has been mentioned. We are not necessarily a very active WTO member in many ways, but we are definitely invested in the WTO structure. And the possibility that will be sidelined in the next decade or even right in the next 5 years is something that is obviously a concern. And as has been mentioned, all of the BRICS members are on one page on supporting the WTO's continued existence. But there are a lot of other multilateral rules and bodies which are now under threat or under state of decay. And that's something India needs to be looking at, even as a group of new multilateral organizations are coming up. And I think those built around climate change, for example, are particularly important. We have already helped create one of those organizations. And now we're looking at producing possibly 2 more. Therefore, those are a set of organizations that are coming up. And then there's a bunch of geopolitical ones in the Indo-Pacific, the revived Quad. They've just announced in India, Australia, Japan, Supply Chain Resilience Organization. There's a whole set of new ones coming up, and then there's another bunch coming up in technology, in which 5G, for example, is one of the battlegrounds. So multilateralism is alive and well, but it's shifting radically, and that's one of the reasons we have to try to be, if you wish, at the table of as many of them as possible, because we're never completely certain which ones will become extremely important 5 years from now.
Absolutely. So Professor, as far it's like has already been mentioned in the program, India is going to host the BRICS summit in 2021. So what do we do, in the lead up to the summit, and how do we keep the momentum going? What is it that we talk about? How do we ensure that the BRICS stays even more relevant in the months to come?
Well, I think much of what we have already done is I think we'll have to pursue that approach, in the sense that if you recall last time when the BRICS summit happened, when India chaired it I think in Goa, there was and it was hosted by India in Goa. There was this issue of terrorism, which I think was pretty front-loaded by India. And I think the point that Ambassador Puri made, that we have to use BRICS as a platform where our ideas, our views, and our interests are also represented. Not simply, we don't want an agenda that is being shaped by others. And therefore, in the past, we have been able to push through certain issues which matter to India. And I think that is very important when you look at how India has been dealing with, in fact, a country like China, because we have a China problem, and that is bilateral, and we have a China problem where issues related, which are very important to India, for example, like terrorism, sometimes get marginalized with China, because China takes a different route on that question bilaterally. So I think using the multilateral fora, using a platform like BRICS allows us that leverage vis-a-vis the Chinese, which we don't otherwise have. So in a sense, issues like terrorism, issues like coordinated response to counter-terror related problems, and I think also this fact of what we have been discussing, how do we evolve a multilateral order that responds to our needs, and not simply the needs of the Chinese, but also our needs. And I think that is an important point to be put on the agenda, because Chinese clearly are interested, and as Pramit was talking, we are looking at a proliferation of initiatives across the board. And a lot of the times what is happening is this coalition of the willing is emerging, where you have issue-specific coalitions are now taking hold of in various parts of the world on various issue areas. So I think to shape that, India needs to be much more proactively engaged with this process with all sets of countries. And I think that is why it is important for India to be represented at BRICS, to be represented at SCO, to be represented at various plurilaterals that are emerging, minilaterals that are emerging, trilaterals that have been talked about, especially in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the kinds of issues that are now going to dominate the next decade, whether it's technology, whether it's climate change, whether it's the fourth industrial revolution, etc. And I think on those issues, India can shape an agenda at this point in time, which perhaps will align India's bilateral agenda with these countries with the larger multilateral agenda. And I think that is where India should be moving as it plans out its next year's summit.
Okay, time now to get quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Frank, thank you very much. Look, I'm a very convinced believer that India has a manifest destiny. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We are on our way to becoming the 3rd largest. We have to become players not only in our region, but we need to be a voice which is heard in the world. The BRICS are an important stepping stone for us, and we are fortunately hosting the next summit after a year. We are also going to be hosting the G20 summit. And so we have really unique opportunities. This is the 75th year of the United Nations, but because of COVID and a variety of other reasons, much is not there on the agenda of the commemorative declaration itself. But as Pramit pointed out, these are processes that must go forward, and we are the demandiers. We need to push for them. The Russians and Chinese won't push for them, the Americans won't. But we are the demandiers, we need to push for them, and we need to try and see that we are there. Climate, I think we should just not underestimate the importance of this matter, no matter that the global lockdown has for a moment resulted in GHG emissions coming down. But this will be one of the defining features, and we need to position ourselves so that we actually sit around the table, the horseshoe or any other table. Thank you.
Okay, all right, Pramit.
Yeah, so I think it's been relatively clear from everything we have said that the global system is changing. New issues are arising, new coalitions are being tested and formed. And it's important not only that India be a member of as many of these coalitions as possible, to be able to set rules or be part of the debate internally. It also requires that we domestically have to be very clear about and define what our interests are, so that we can align our multilateral policies and these debates with what we need at home. And I think what we're seeing to some degree on climate, on supply chains, and possibly in the future, maybe things like nuclear non-proliferation and so on, will be all things that we need to become much more active in, as well as keeping a hold of the various other organizations, such as legacy ones, such as BRICS, and so on and so forth, SARC and so on. So these are organizations, some of them are not in great shape, some of them are half dead, but some of them may come back to life later on. But we have to make sure we have a finger in each and every pie.
Okay. Harshvi Pant, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
Well, I would just say that, the world was changing even before COVID struck us. So now, and COVID has simply accentuated a number of these trends. And one of the most important trends here is that the multilateral order, as we had known it, seems to be at an inflection point. And I think the new coalitions, the new agenda points, the new ways of managing some of these broader problems around the world that are emerging is both an opportunity, and also a challenge. And I think that the challenge is that how do you juggle so many balls in the air, at the same time? But the opportunity is that I think India is in particular is in a position